The first thing I noticed was not anger, it was silence, the kind that arrives slowly and then refuses to leave. My husband and I still shared the same house, the same bed, the same routine, yet something essential had gone missing. We spoke every day, but our words no longer reached each other. They floated between us and fell quietly to the floor. Mornings felt automatic. Coffee brewed while he stared at his phone, already elsewhere before the day even began. I would mention small things, errands, thoughts, memories, anything to feel acknowledged. He answered with short sounds or distracted nods, rarely lifting his eyes. I learned to stop repeating myself. I learned to swallow sentences halfway through. Evenings carried a heavier weight. Dinner used to be our pause button, a moment where the world slowed and we reconnected. Now the television spoke for us. Forks tapped against plates. The space between us grew wider with every quiet meal. I watched him exist beside me, close enough to touch, distant enough to feel unreachable. He was not cruel. That truth confused me the most. Cruelty would have given me something solid to hold against him. Neglect was shapeless. It left me questioning my worth, my expectations, my place in his life. I wondered when I became background noise, when my presence stopped requiring attention. At night, I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing, asking myself questions I was afraid to speak out loud. Did he notice the distance, or had it become comfortable for him? Had I changed, or had he simply stopped looking? I replayed memories of the man who once listened carefully, who asked follow-up questions, who treated my thoughts as if they mattered. I never confronted him. I did not want arguments or apologies that changed nothing. I wanted respect. I wanted to finish a sentence without interruption. Wanting those things felt embarrassing, as if I were asking for too much instead of something basic. Slowly, I began to disappear inside my own home. I chose silence over being dismissed. I lowered my expectations, so disappointment would hurt less. That was when I understood a difficult truth. Loneliness does not always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being with someone who no longer sees you. And that realization stayed with me, long after the lights were turned off. Days blended together, each one quietly identical to the last. I kept the house running, kept myself composed, kept pretending that this hollow feeling was temporary. Friends asked how marriage was going, and I smiled automatically, offering safe answers that revealed nothing. Admitting the truth felt disloyal, even though the loneliness already lived openly inside me. I noticed how careful I became with my emotions. I edited myself before speaking, removing anything that sounded like a need. I told myself that strong women did not complain, that patience was a virtue, that love evolved into something calmer over time. Yet calm should not feel like erasure. Partnership should not feel like performing invisibility. Sometimes I stood in the kitchen and watched reflections move across the window, wondering when my world had shrunk to routines and restraint. I missed being asked how my day truly was. I missed laughter that arrived without effort. I missed feeling chosen instead of simply present. The silence followed me everywhere. Even when he was not home, it echoed in empty rooms and filled the air between my thoughts. I began to realize that waiting for someone to notice your absence while you are standing right in front of them is its own kind of heartbreak. And still, I stayed quiet, hoping respect would return on its own. There were moments I blamed myself entirely. Maybe I had become boring. Maybe I talked too much or too little. Maybe this was simply the natural outcome of time. But deep down, I knew love did not require effort to acknowledge. Respect did not fade unless it was neglected. I watched couples in public, noticing small gestures, attentive listening, gentle patience. It hurt in a quiet way. Not jealousy, but recognition of something missing. I did not want grand romance. I wanted consideration. I wanted to feel like my presence made a difference. Each night ended the same way. Lights off, words unsaid, a growing awareness that something would have to change, even if I did not yet know how. That awareness settled into me slowly, like a truth waiting for permission. I began to understand that staying silent was also a choice, and choices shape futures. I did not know where this path would lead, only that continuing as I was felt unbearable. Somewhere beyond this quiet, I hoped respect still existed, even if I had forgotten what it felt like. I told myself to be patient a little longer, to observe, to listen, to understand what my heart was trying to say beneath the disappointment. Because ignoring that voice had already cost me too much, and I sensed that soon, silence would no longer be an option. This was not anger building inside me. It was clarity. A quiet recognition that respect is not requested, it is offered. And when it disappears, something fundamental breaks. I did not know it yet, but this understanding was the beginning of everything changing. I held on to that thought as the days passed, letting it settle, letting it grow. Because once you see the absence clearly, you can never return to pretending it does not matter. And so I waited, not for him to change, but for myself to finally acknowledge what my silence had been hiding all along. The restaurant was not somewhere I planned to love. It was small, tucked between louder places that relied on bright signs and rushed service. I found it by accident on a rainy afternoon when I needed to be anywhere but home. The smell of garlic and warm bread greeted me before I even stepped inside, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing it in. He was the chef, Italian, with a calm presence that seemed to slow the room without effort. He looked up when I entered, not just to acknowledge a customer, but as if he actually noticed me. Not in a way that felt intrusive, in a way that felt respectful. It surprised me how unfamiliar that feeling had become. I sat alone at a small table near the window. When he brought the menu, he spoke softly, explaining dishes as if he enjoyed the words themselves. When I asked a question, he listened fully before answering. No rushing, no distraction, just attention. I thanked him more than necessary, embarrassed by how much it meant. The food was simple, comforting, made with care, but it was not the meal that stayed with me. It was the way he checked in, asking if everything was to my liking without hovering, the way he waited for my response instead of assuming it, the way he spoke to me like my opinion mattered. I returned the following week, telling myself it was about the pasta. He remembered me, not just my order, but that I preferred tea over coffee. That detail settled something deep in my chest. At home, my preferences were forgotten constantly. Here, they were noted without effort. We spoke only briefly at first, polite exchanges, small smiles, but every interaction felt balanced, equal. He never talked over me, never dismissed a thought. When he asked how my day was, he waited for the answer. That simple patience felt heavier than any romantic gesture ever could. I noticed how my posture changed there, how I spoke more freely, how my laugh came easier. I was not performing or shrinking. I was just present, and being present did not feel exhausting. It felt natural. One afternoon, he asked what brought me in so often. The question was casual, but genuine. I hesitated, then answered carefully. "It feels peaceful here," I said. He smiled, not like someone receiving a compliment, but like someone who understood the value of creating that space. I did not tell him about my marriage. I did not need to. This was not about replacing anyone. It was about remembering what respect felt like in the first place, about realizing that it still existed in the world, even if it had vanished at home. I began to notice the contrast more clearly. At home, my words were overlooked. Here, they were received. At home, I felt like an interruption. Here, I felt welcome. That difference followed me long after I left the restaurant, lingering in my thoughts during quiet evenings. I asked myself difficult questions on the drive home. Why did basic courtesy feel so powerful? Why did being listened to feel like a gift instead of a given? The answers unsettled me. They pointed toward truths I had avoided for too long. Nothing inappropriate happened. No lines were crossed. Yet something inside me shifted. Respect, I realized, was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was steady, intentional, and deeply felt. And once you experience it again, it becomes impossible to ignore its absence elsewhere. By the time I reached my street, the rain had stopped. But the clarity stayed with me. I walked into my house quietly, aware that something fundamental had changed, not because of another man, but because I had been reminded of my own worth. Days passed, but the memory of the Italian chef stayed with me longer than I expected. It was not just the meals or the quiet charm of the restaurant. It was the way he treated me like I mattered. That feeling became a mirror, reflecting the years of neglect I had slowly accepted at home. I remember one evening, sitting alone at the same table, watching the rain streak the windows. The restaurant was nearly empty, and the soft hum of conversation and clinking plates created a gentle rhythm. He approached my table with a plate, not as a server handing over food, but as someone presenting something crafted with care. "Try this," he said simply. His eyes held no expectation, just patience. And in that simplicity, I felt an unfamiliar weight lift from my chest. I began noticing patterns at home that I had previously ignored. My husband no longer listened when I spoke, often brushing my words aside or interrupting with his own concerns. The small courtesies I had once counted on asking how I was, noticing when I seemed tired, acknowledging achievements had faded into silence. The contrast with the chef's attention became unbearable at times. I could not unsee it, nor unfeel it. One afternoon, while preparing dinner for the family, I found myself replaying moments from the restaurant. How he had asked my opinion on a recipe, how he remembered the smallest details. I realized I had forgotten what it was like to be valued without having to demand it. That realization hit me harder than I expected. It was a quiet accusation, directed not at him, but at the neglect I had silently endured. I began to question myself. Why had I tolerated so little at home? Why had I accepted the absence of respect as normal? And most importantly, why did I feel a spark of longing for something as simple as attention and acknowledgement? The answers were uncomfortable, yet illuminating. I had learned to survive without being seen, but surviving was no longer enough. The chef's presence did not tempt me into infidelity. I never crossed that line. Instead, it reminded me of boundaries I had allowed to blur and of the dignity I had sidelined. Respect, I realized, was more than politeness. It was a form of love, a recognition of the self that no other relationship could substitute. And for the first time in years, I understood that I deserved it, fully and without compromise. At home, the tension grew. I spoke more cautiously, measuring my words, wondering if the stark contrast between what I experienced outside and what I endured inside would be noticed. My husband's indifference became glaring, impossible to overlook. Conversations that once slipped by unnoticed now felt like walls I could not pass through. Silence, once comforting, turned suffocating. I found myself standing at the edge of a decision, unsure whether to confront the neglect directly or continue seeking solace in fleeting moments outside. Each visit to the restaurant became a ritual, not for escape, but for grounding. I reminded myself of what it meant to be treated with dignity, to be seen and acknowledged in ways that mattered deeply. That awareness, once awakened, would not fade. One rainy evening, the chef brought a small cup of espresso to my table, placing it before me with a gentle smile. "For you," he said, as if the gesture carried more meaning than the words themselves. In that moment, I realized the depth of my longing was not for him, but for recognition, for the respect I had denied myself by staying silent for so long. It was a revelation both bitter and sweet, a truth I could no longer ignore. I left the restaurant that night with a resolve I had not felt in years. Something inside me shifted, a quiet determination that respect, care, and acknowledgement were not optional but essential. And though I had yet to voice these truths at home, I knew that my world had changed. I had been reminded of what I deserved, and the journey to reclaim it was only beginning. The days following my visits to the restaurant brought a restless energy I could not ignore. At home, routines felt heavier, conversations emptier, and the silence between my husband and me louder than ever. I began noticing how small gestures once meaningless carried weight, whether in their absence or presence. Every ignored remark, every glance that passed without acknowledgement, became a reminder of the distance that had grown over the years. One evening, I attempted to initiate a conversation, hoping to bridge the gap. "Did you notice the changes in the garden?" I asked, trying to anchor the discussion in something neutral. His reply was distracted, short, and dismissive. That moment crystallized everything I had been feeling. My efforts to be seen, heard, and valued were continuously overlooked. I felt an ache in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and awakening. I had spent so long trying to fit into a space that no longer existed, hoping for recognition that would never come unless demanded. The Italian chef, unaware of the impact he had on me, remained a symbol of what I had forgotten I deserved. His courtesy, attention, and calm presence contrasted sharply with the emotional void I faced daily. It was not infatuation, it was an education in self-worth. With every interaction at the restaurant, I learned that respect was not negotiable and that the absence of it could quietly erode the foundation of any relationship. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I watched families and friends around me laughing, sharing stories, and connecting effortlessly. A pang of longing struck me not for what I lacked materially, but for the warmth of attention, consideration, and care. I realized that I had unknowingly placed all my hopes on a love that had grown complacent, expecting my presence without giving the attention it deserved in return. The clarity was both painful and liberating. Returning home later that night, I carried the quiet resolve I had nurtured during those visits. I began to assert small boundaries, politely declining requests that drained me, insisting on acknowledgement for efforts often overlooked, and voicing opinions I had suppressed for years. Each act felt revolutionary. Each assertion reminded me that respect was not something to be begged for, it was something to claim. And in claiming it, I discovered a part of myself I had set aside, a self that was no longer willing to fade into invisibility. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when my husband made a remark, dismissive and cutting, about my choices. Instead of retreating into silence, I met his words with calm, firm acknowledgement of how his neglect had affected me. For the first time, I spoke not from a place of anger or accusation, but from clarity and self-respect. His surprise was palpable. The dynamics shifted slightly, subtly, but enough for me to notice. I was no longer invisible. I was present, asserting my worth. Despite these changes, fear lingered. Fear of confrontation, fear of the unknown, and fear of disrupting what little stability remained. But alongside fear, there was empowerment, a quiet force urging me forward. I understood that seeking respect and recognition was not betrayal, it was survival. It was a reclamation of dignity, long deferred, and an acknowledgement that the care I had yearned for was not a luxury, but a necessity. The restaurant became my sanctuary, a place to reflect, regroup, and remind myself of the lessons I had learned. Attention, courtesy, and respect are not trivial. They are the foundations of any meaningful connection. And while I remained committed to my family, I realized that the way forward required honesty, courage, and a refusal to accept neglect as the norm. It required me to honor my worth, regardless of how others chose to respond. That evening, as I closed my journal and reflected on the changes within me, I knew I was standing at a threshold. One path led back to silent compromise, the other toward assertive self-respect and clarity in all relationships. I chose the latter. And as I lay down to sleep, I felt a peace that had eluded me for years, a quiet understanding that reclaiming respect was not just for me, but for the life I still hoped to nurture. The days following my growing awareness felt heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier, because the realization of years spent in neglect had settled into my chest like an unshakable weight. Lighter, because with that weight came clarity, and clarity brought freedom of thought. I could no longer ignore the difference between love as I had imagined it and love as I truly deserved. My interactions with the Italian chef had become more than fleeting moments. They were reminders that respect, kindness, and attentiveness were not negotiable. And yet, life at home remained a landscape of avoidance and dismissive gestures. One evening, my husband returned later than usual. I had cooked a simple meal, hoping to bridge the distance with shared conversation. But when he walked in, the same habitual indifference greeted me. "Dinner's ready," I said softly. No eye contact. No warmth. My chest tightened. In the past, I would have swallowed my disappointment, forced a smile, and kept the conversation alive. That night, however, something inside me shifted. Instead of retreating into silence, I looked up, holding his gaze. "I've been feeling overlooked," I admitted quietly, and I need acknowledgement for the effort I put in, just as I respect yours. He froze. The words, simple yet firm, hung in the air like fragile glass. His expression betrayed surprise, as though he had never considered that his actions or inactions might affect me so profoundly. I didn't speak further. I let the silence do its work, letting him confront the reality he had ignored for so long. That night I slept differently. I was neither triumphant nor bitter. I was aware. Awareness became my new companion, as grounding as it was unsettling. The following weekend, I found myself walking through the streets of the city alone, letting the hum of life envelop me. Families laughing, couples sharing tender moments, friends chatting animatedly. Everything felt amplified, and yet strangely removed. I realized that my longing was not for material comfort or fleeting excitement, but for a consistent presence, for emotional nourishment I had long denied myself. I thought about the chef's subtle acts of kindness, the attentiveness in his questions, the patience in his listening. These were small gestures, but they illuminated a glaring truth. Respect and care were transformative. They were the lifeblood of human connection, something I had assumed existed by default at home, but which I had been starving for. It was in that moment, standing on the balcony overlooking the bustling streets below, that I made a decision. I could no longer let complacency dictate the terms of my life. I could no longer assume that being seen, heard, and valued was a given. If I wanted love that was nurturing, I had to demand respect without fear, to claim space for my feelings, and to honor my own worth, even if it meant facing resistance. That night, I wrote in my journal, words spilling onto paper with a mix of pain and exhilaration. I will not fade into silence. I will not accept neglect as the standard. I am worthy of respect, of attention, of care, and I will seek it wherever it is offered genuinely. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes began to emerge. I became more deliberate in my interactions, asserting myself gently but firmly. Simple things, a request for acknowledgement, a shared decision about household matters, an expression of my preferences became exercises in self-respect. Some responses were met with resistance, a flinch, or a momentary coldness. Others, surprisingly, were met with compliance, perhaps even admiration. The pattern was inconsistent, yet I no longer relied on his reactions to validate my self-worth. My power was internal, independent of his recognition. During one visit to the restaurant, I lingered longer than usual, drawn not only by the food, but by the sanctuary it had become. The chef greeted me with his customary warmth, but I noticed something deeper, a sense of pride, as though he recognized the quiet transformation within me. We spoke of ordinary things, recipes, ingredients, shared laughter, but the subtext was unmistakable. I was learning that respect was both given and received, and that the absence of it could never diminish the value I held for myself. That realization became a shield, fortifying me against years of neglect and underestimation. I returned home one evening, resolved to address the unspoken tensions in my marriage with honesty and compassion. I sat across from him at the dining table, steadying my hands. I want to rebuild connection, I began, but it must be built on respect, attentiveness, and acknowledgement. I cannot continue in silence or feel invisible. I am asking for partnership, not compliance. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, defensiveness, and perhaps the first stirrings of awareness. I did not demand an immediate response. I only offered clarity, and with it, an invitation to change. The next few days were a test. His reactions ranged from dismissive remarks to tentative engagement. It was a slow, uneven process, and yet I felt empowered. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I was awake, assertive, and aware. The chef's kindness had been a catalyst, yes, but the transformation belonged to me. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my ability to demand what I deserved. And though uncertainty lingered how he would ultimately respond, whether this marriage could evolve, the certainty of my own worth was unshakable. By the end of the week, I realized I had reached a pivotal crossroads. I could continue in the comfort of denial, or I could embrace the courage it took to insist on respect, even at the cost of disruption. I chose the latter. The awareness of my own value, nurtured through small acts of self-assertion and the silent lessons of kindness from an unexpected source, had become the foundation for a new chapter in my life. And now, I pose the question to you. If you were in my place, navigating years of neglect while discovering respect and care elsewhere, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love to read your perspectives.